Distortion? All right, cool. All right, midterms are trickling in. You have until Thursday at 5. You don't have to take that long. Enough said about that. All right, one of the things that I've decided to do, particularly with this class, given the textbooks that I've assigned to you, is look at the whole cultural dimension without necessarily telling you what to think or how to think, but having you examine that, the things that you are thinking have been taught to you, and that you could change them if necessary. So, as an example, we've been having this behind the scenes, or if you work with student government, you probably have been aware of this, that there's been this whole conversation about whether there should be mandatory cultural competency training. Now, I'm on the side where, yeah, you should, because the suggestion was basically that everybody in the college should at least have 18 hours in a academic year, which amounts to 2 hours per month, and then basically selecting from a number of different things. So I train white supremacists to be culturally competent drug counselors. So my level of diversity training would be a little bit different than an entry-level person who probably doesn't know that, no, you can think whatever you want, but in a federal workplace, you don't get to say what you want. Sorry. The Latino students who object to the Confederate flag, sorry, Confederate flag in somebody's private car on our parking lot is protected speech. But from my point of view, I always like it when the enemy announces their presence. Better than not. And until this movie came out, there's a movie out now, so better catch it while you can. I saw it last night. 12 Years a Slave. It's a true story about a guy living in New York with his family, and he gets tricked into going to D.C. to do a gig. He's a musician, and he gets captured and sent into slavery down south. So he has to hide the fact that he can play music, but he has to hide that he can read and write, and he has a college degree and a job. And, basically lives 12 years that way, right? So the whole culture of the Confederacy was built on that. That is a true depiction of, and a relatively mellow depiction of what slavery was about, basically. A culture that promoted addiction. So some people think, oh, well, I have a right to my Confederate flag because it's my culture, it's my heritage. Well, okay, yeah, if you're from Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, but Oregon was not a Confederate state, so you're actually saying something else. Okay, we believe in democracy here. One person, one vote. Confederacy wasn't down with that. So that may be my political statement that I can make in front of a classroom, but examine the assumptions behind the culture. So teaching culture. In week 2, we talked about America being a culture in which has a major investment in the promotion and maintenance of addictive behaviors. So if you think about big pharma, you think about the tobacco industry, and the reason I put them together is because many times they're the same folks. Kraft Foods makes Miller beer, and also and Marlboro's. So it's pretty clear that, corporate aside, it's big business. So, they want you to use their products, right? So, maintenance of addictive behavior. So, we talk about this dimension and what you can do about it, the culture of dimension. So, it actually should be when we talk. Moving too fast for my own good here. Okay, so culture is like a dimension. And what you can do about it if you're not already part of a culture of resistance, so I'm just giving you the idea, already know that The class presumes that you're not already part of a culture of resistance. Sorry if you are, I'm not trying to diss you, but you know where I'm coming from with that. So in the spirit of resistance and in the wisdom way of the teacher, we proceed. So the fourfold way, and I realize that yes, I am giving away an answer to the midterm if you haven't answered it, but this ain't about that. Okay? So I'm using the fourfold way because it's a white anthropologist. Now, technically, Angeles Arian being Basque, there might be a question as to whether she's white. Just like 100 years ago, there was a question whether Germans were white or the Irish or Scots were white in this country. They weren't considered white by the Anglo-Saxon Americans. You know, Ben Franklin didn't like Germans, and that there were too many Germans in Philadelphia, but that was because of the Hessian thing, that is, German mercenaries used by the British government in colonial days. So, yeah, the Irish and Scots are a whole other question. So those folks weren't considered white and then got moved into the white racial category, which is in itself a false category. But the idea, Angeles Arian saying, okay, I'm an anthropologist, we need to understand culture in a way that's friendly to non-anthropologists. So let's say, and then not only what culture gives you is not only kind of an explanation for what's happening, but also a way to be within it. So she's saying there's 4 ways of being that are optimal. The warrior, show up and be present, and the right use of power. The healer, pay attention to what has heart and meaning, and extend love. Now, that word, I'm not going to get into the entire explanations of each one today, but later if you want. But extending love, what I will say about that, just like the Inuit people are said to have multiple words for frozen water, where we just have ice and snow and sleet. Oh, and freezing rain. Oh, and freezing fog. Right? They would have a separate word for each one of those conditions. There's ice and snow that you can make an igloo from. There's ice you can walk upon and ice you can't. You probably want to have different words for those things, right? So that people know. Well, we only have 2 words for love, or actually a few words for love. There might be synonyms, but for example, whenever I ask people to think, how many different words for love do you know or do you think of, they'll usually go Christian on you. So agape and eros. All right, fine. Brotherly love and erotic love. Okay. But if you go Aramaic, then there's a transpersonal love, which is what he's talking about in Love Your Enemies in Aramaic, which is yet another context that they don't talk about. So extend love could mean lots of different things, especially if you have to love your enemy. Okay, there's tough love. We talk about that. Well, what kind of love does that mean? Right? So healer, pay attention to what has heart and meaning, extend love. The visionary, express creativity and vision, tell the truth without blame or judgment. This can get you in trouble frequently. Telling the truth without blame or judgment. And the teacher, model wisdom, be open to outcome, not attached to outcome. So while many of us have preferences, Angie's basic idea is that all of us have aspects of these simultaneously. And we may prefer to do certain things in certain ways, but we have all of them. And each one of these has a shadow side too, which I'm not necessarily going to get till later in the broadcast as well. But the approach I'm using is going to use all 4 simultaneously and break down so you can replicate it. Or you can ask questions too. So, have I introduced this word to you before? Okay, pronounce it then. Well, it's Portuguese. So, yeah. Okay. So this is a word that doesn't exist in English because it's Portuguese. It's conscientização. There actually isn't an English equivalent for it. So that's how you pronounce it, conscientização. And it's both a noun and a verb. So what it means is learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. Now, you can tell a lot by a word and its worldview by how it's defined in English. So there is no English word that fits this exactly. Conscientious kind of doesn't get it. But basically learning to see or detect that there's contradictions, like there's a difference between what they say and what they do. Liberty and justice for all, if you can afford it. Or whatever, you know. So I'm basically highlighting the contradictions. Some are spoken of, some are not. And know where they are different. So this is actually from a Wikipedia reference, which, again, the only reason I'm doing that is just to show you that this is in popular culture. Not necessarily accurate, but, you know, if you want accurate, then read the book from the cat who wrote it. So Paulo Freire, who died about a little over a decade ago. Critical consciousness, conscientization, which is basically trying to anglicize the word, Englishize the word, or conscientização, is a popular educational social concept developed by a renowned Brazilian pedagogue and educational theorist, Paulo Freire, in which he focuses on achieving an in-depth understanding of the world, allowing for the perception and exposure of social and political contradictions. Critical consciousness also includes taking action against oppressive elements in one's life that are illuminated by that understanding. So it's one thing to recognize that things are screwed up. It's another to actually adjust your life so that you're actually part of the change. So, in the practice of conscientização, teachers are learners, and learners teach from their experience. So, he talked about teacher-learners. So, he was educated. And he basically said, and you could write this down, there are two purposes for education. One, domestication. And two, liberation. So as an example, as I've talked about before, you know, when you wear a cap and gown, you are buying into an educational system that was created by the Catholic Church nearly a millennia ago to replicate good Catholics. Columbus discovered America. And basically, you know, American history and European history and, you know, when they talk about Western civilization, to replicate that. Now, one of the foundations of democracy And what the Founding Fathers talked about was, okay, in order to have a democracy, you need a literate, educated populace. Unfortunately, in their point of view, that only meant men like them, because education wasn't given to everyone. Wasn't. That wasn't the model they learned from the natives, who had democracy before the Founding Fathers, but that was the thing that they wanted. So when Freire talks about the second purpose for education being liberation, he's basically saying, look, the teacher learners, which are those who had degrees from domesticated education, okay, who were legitimately empowered to teach classes, and learner teachers, those who had degrees from the school of hard knocks, shall we say. So he developed this idea, basically working with people in the the Brazilian favelas, which we would call ghettos. Saying, okay, y'all have experience too. Y'all have experience on how to live and survive with like next to no money. Daily violence, police attacks, drug dealing gang attacks. How do you survive doing that? How do you survive when the basic services from the state, like water and electricity, fail on a regular basis? How do you get sanitation, food cooking, all that stuff done? Well, they get it done. And he pointed out, yeah, if you have a university degree, could you live on the street? Could you be homeless? Does the university teach you how to be homeless? Like I was saying with Crash the other day. Okay? Classism. Okay? The default cultural position of the university and community college is middle class. That's the point of view. And I didn't start out middle class. And I'm not necessarily in favor of a system that favors my point of view. I don't trust it, just because it favors my point of view. Because I don't think it's going to be just, because not everybody has access to it. That bothers me. Has bothered me since middle school, actually. So, in the practice of conscientious examen, sometimes when you lose, you win. That is, you gain, this is one example. You gain wisdom on what didn't work, playing by the rules. So I like, in popular culture, I remember this story when it was a short story, then a book, and now it's a movie, Ender's Game. So Ender learns that if you play by the rules, you get killed. If you're like being bullied, you can't depend on anybody to protect you from the bully. Try and use your brain first, but sometimes the bully has to be wiped out. Sorry, it's not nonviolent. But, bullies are afraid. That's why they're bullies, so they use fear. Show them you're not afraid, and make it clear that they're not to mess with you. However you want to pull that off. Anyway, sometimes when you lose, you win. You gain wisdom on what didn't work. So that's a gain. Sometimes playing by the rules is you lose, especially if a system is corrupt. Playing by the stated rules will still make you lose. And so then at least you win by gaining knowledge. So sometimes when you win, you lose. Like you could win a short-term victory, but lose long-term because the system is still structurally corrupt. So getting rid of one person or busting one person isn't a long-term solution. I learned this going up against the county. So getting rid of a corrupt county administrator, great. That administrator came from somewhere and was supported by a system that doesn't allow accountability. And then when you try and hold them accountable privately, they try and intimidate you. I mean, I had this happen to me personally, so I know. So sometimes the change you seek is within yourself and the hearts of those you influence, rather than unresponsive systems. That's going to remain invisible, because the system isn't going to advertise that it's corrupt or that it isn't working. So that's why the whole concept of prevention guerrillas. If I allow you to gain the knowledge to become better and not to rely on the system loses, even though I don't have an overt victory. See how that works? All right, so if it don't kill you, it makes you stronger and smarter. So, the idea that you're under attack, you're a target. This is the normal state of affairs, to be a consumer / slave / citizen. That's basically visionary. Tell the truth without blame or judgment. Giving you the tools and awareness to fight back and be healthy, or be a more contented slave if you want to be. That's warrior orientation. Stand up, be present. You probably don't want to be. Now, because I've given you the opportunity to be aware of your wounding, that makes you a healer. And still up to you to heal it. And this also scares some people off. You can pass the class without attending to your own wounding, but will you be free otherwise? So I have seen that happen. Person can get A's in this class and in the pro class and still wind up shooting meth afterwards. Seen it happen. Okay? So you can be an addict, which essentially medically describes an unbalanced or unhealthy relationship to a substance or process, without being a criminal. Okay? Because being addicted to video games is not criminal. You can be a criminal, so a person who commits person or property crimes or both, without being an addict, too. So it's important to know which is which and what is what in aiding your own recovery. There are criminal addicts. There are. So, people who can essentially, walk by a car in a parking lot, see a purse or something on the floor or on the seat, car is unlocked or the windows rolled down, and they could think, well, I'd say a, quote, normal person would think, wow, that should be locked up, but I'm not going to reach in, that's their thing. And a criminal might walk by and say, oh, easy pickings. Boom, there it is. So, some criminals are addicts. They have to deal with the addiction and the criminal thinking. Even if they aren't addicted, they can often have criminal thinking, which is a separate piece. Some addicts become criminals to service their addiction, but their criminal thinking clears with recovery, because they're no longer having to support a habit by doing crime. So I'm just making this, this is not the pro class, but there is a distinction that pros make about criminal thinking. Some criminal thinking clears when it isn't being fueled by some. Some people are not addicts and think criminally because there's not an energy rush, an adrenaline rush that they get addicted to by doing crime, which makes it a process addiction. But again, because of the world of how criminal justice works, they're not necessarily into looking at medical models, because they're thinking some things can't be cured, because that's how you become. So in conscientious design, we basically look at, there are these contradictions that are pretty big ones. You have to come up with your own personal answer, especially if you're dealing with people that are in your life, that are causing you problems. For example, they might not be entirely sane and still be running game on you. Pretend to go to treatment, fail in treatment, or graduate from treatment, go back to whatever they were doing that was making you causing you grief. So you have to be able to look at those contradictions accurately and come up with an answer that works for you. So in the wisdom way of the teacher, in addiction, you're pretty much focused exclusively on the physical within the physical body, if that's an ingestive addiction. If it's a process addiction, you're not addicted necessarily to the substance, but you're addicted to the way doing the process makes you feel. Okay? You still have a need for something greater than yourself. Okay? You sense there might be something more, and there is, but how do you get there? It's kind of like, I've encountered people, especially in the electronic age, who feel such a profound sense of disconnection from themselves that they need a machine to feel connected, and will actually freak out if they text their friends and don't get an immediate response back. They feel alone. Or if the texting doesn't work, they'll go on to FB or whatever the sites are, and if one of their friends, particularly, for example, if they're gamers, right? So if they go in a multiplayer game and none of the friends are there, they feel alone. How about being content within yourself? Well, that doesn't occur to them. There's just a big emptiness in there. Doesn't go well in terms of quoting them the Tao. Like, the usefulness of this cup is because it's empty. You can fill it with something. But even if you feel like there's a void, like space, space isn't empty. You just can't breathe. There's no breathable atmosphere out there, but it's not empty. It's full of energy. So inside of you is not empty if you're alive. Just feel empty. Adjust your senses accordingly. So, how you get there? In the wisdom way of the teacher, life is a school, and you repeat the lessons, or the lessons are repeated until you get it, and then thrown at you again in variations to make sure you got it. Isn't that the annoying thing about algebra and word problems? Didn't you hate those? Like being able to figure out real world situations and how math is in them, or in algebra getting the same equations over and over and over. Well, the idea is that you have the answers inside of you already, or you wouldn't be facing the problem. So if you remember that enantiodromia, problems lead to solutions. Solutions to those problems generate more problems. Sometimes the problem is the way you see the problem. That the way you're living is generating the problem. So the way that you see things is the problem. So life is a school, and you repeat the lessons, or the lessons are repeated until you get it, then thrown at you in variations till you get it, and then you teach them to others, because others will run into the same problem. This is what I tell pros. Okay, you're training to be a pro. What happens when you get you as a client? Prepare for when you have you as a client. And you can't be annoyed. You actually have to cope with them and deal with them. In fact, the fact that you are annoyed means that they're probably closer to being you than not. Many people, I might not have thrown this quote at you before, but this is coming from the, before conscientious Zen was a term in the 20th century. It was a practice. So the reason she's called General Harriet Tubman in this particular context was in the Battle of the Combahee River action. Have I mentioned this before? Okay, so Harriet Tubman is known by as conductor in the Underground Railroad, right? That's usually what people know her by if she's been known at all, right? So in the Underground Railroad, she basically freed about 350 slaves, moving them from the south into the north clandestinely. At the Combahee River action, where she was the military commander and selected the military commanders and took several gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina, and in a week she freed 700 slaves. So twice as many slaves in 1 week than she did in her entire Underground Railroad experience. So when she says this quote, no, it's not that her math is off. It's just that you're only allowed to know her as a conductor of the Underground Railroad, not as a black female military commander in the 19th century. Because we didn't have black female military commanders in the 19th century. And that's a problem with the culture. Who would follow a black woman into battle to free slaves? Well, a few people would. So I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. And how can they not know they were slaves? That's deep. Dr. Matula Shakur, currently in prison. One of Tupac Shakur's stepfathers, if you will. So Dr. Shakur, medical doctor, ran the Black Panthers' free heroin detox program. Getting people off of heroin, detoxing them and keeping them clean and sober for free. $0. But that was a threat. So COINTELPRO program basically said, well, you know some people that robbed a bank. And even though you didn't rob the bank, and even though you didn't get any money from the bank robbery, being that you're running a Black Panther drug detox program, and because we can kind of loosely tie these people to the Black Panthers, you're culpable. So you're in prison now for life. What's criminal about getting drug addicts off of drugs for free? This is a Trojan, what I'm describing to you is a Trojan horse warfare. So you've probably seen the movie Troy, right? Maybe? Brad Pitt as Achilles and all that, right? Trojan horse warfare. So Trojan horse is a weapon disguised as a gift. It's often, I think there's a cybernetic context in which it's basically a worm or a virus as well. So Trojan horse warfare. So in some people's rules of engagement, this is fair play. So for example, the rules of engagement are basically officially what actions are allowed within a military conflict. How do you engage the enemy? How do you engage civilians? It's called the rules of engagement. There are also rules of engagement for dealing with police and police conduct with citizens, et cetera, et cetera. Rules of engagement. So this can tell you, when you do a cultural analysis, like, okay, what culture is this okay? So caveat emptor, that's Latin from the Romans, let the buyer beware. All right? So Trojan horse warfare. So in some people's warfare, in indigenous warfare, that is indigenous to here, Turtle Island, you don't want to deceive your enemy. You want to meet your enemy strong. It's a point of honor. To have your honor be your enemy be strong. And if you lose, well, there's nothing, no dishonor in losing to a strong enemy. Okay, if there is deception, then it's not necessarily making your enemy weaker. That's not a point of honor, right? But in some people's rules of engagement, this is fair play, to give them a weapon disguised as a gift. Okay? Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. This means the seller can and is allowed to be corrupt. So they're saying it's on the buyer to detect the corruption. But we're not going to do anything about corrupt sellers? That's what it's saying. Okay? So, in Trojan horse warfare, you think it's harmless, but it's there to harm you. Maybe not immediately, but over the long term. So which is more effective addictive practice? Kill you now, or have you kill yourself slowly while they make money from your illness and slow decline? Which is the better strategy? Okay, this is why John Jacobs, not that you know who he is or was, but he was the head of the Urban League, which is kind of like a black, mellow version of the NAACP. That is, you know, we're into civil rights, but not if it necessarily upsets business. Because the Urban League was originally funded by the Rockefeller family. And it's focused in urban towns, and basically it's about, you know, job creation or job readiness, etc., etc. That's their thing. Not upsetting the capitalist apple cart. So John Jacobs said, every year, more black people die from drugs, and he was talking about illegal drugs. It's still true for that, but I usually say that it's, if you break down the figure that we learned in this class, social math. So if every day more people die from legal drugs than died at 9/11, then black people are at least 300 of those every day. 300 black people die from legal drugs every day, part of that figure. So you multiply that out, the Ku Klux Klan historically killed at least 10,000 people. That's 10,000 documented in a basically 50-year period. So if we do the math on that, then more black people die from alcohol and tobacco and big pharma every year than the Klan killed in its entire history. So, lynching, it's dramatic, but we're doing this to ourselves. And it's more profitable. Right? But if it's happening to us, it's happening to you, too. Just saying. Then they sell you the cures, which add more illness and more decline. Okay, so if you have hypertension, which could be cured with diet and exercise, but then they give you a pill, and the pill makes you impotent, then the same company sells you Viagra to contradict that. Tricksy, precious. Next. All right. So, Trojan horse warfare. So I just described the situation, and in my culture you don't describe a situation unless you have a solution for it. So, Nubian horse warfare. So, a Nubian horse. So I'd have to describe what Nubia is, and I will, but I'm basically giving you the idea Nubian horse warfare is to counter Trojan horse warfare. Okay? So, I'm native and African, so I grew up on cowboy movies. It's always like cowboys and Indians, right? There's actually a joke about the Lone Ranger Tonto, we're surrounded by Indians. And Tonto goes, what do you mean we, white men? But in all those movies, you know, the cavalry is always coming to the rescue of the settlers or the fort or whatever. But for some of us, we recognize, and this is part of conscientious sound, the cavalry ain't coming. And if it is coming, it ain't coming to rescue us or you. Corporations have more money than the government does, and in a fight where the golden rule prevails, them's that got the gold makes the rules. Who you think is going to win? So in a fight where the golden rule prevails, then the rules benefit those with the most gold. And if corporations have more gold than the government, what do you think is going to happen? So a Trojan horse is a weapon disguised as a gift. And the old saying that goes with that is beware of Greeks bearing gifts. That's where that little adage come from. Trojan horses can be commonly accepted objects or systems. So there was a native elder that once talked about, in the 20th century, he talked about there are 3 tests that came to native people: the Bible, the bottle, and the casino. Now, what he was talking about in that context, so this was a red Indian saying this, and so black Indians say, yeah, right. They're Trojan horses. But red Indians didn't know about Trojan horses because red Indians weren't at Troy. Africans were. So we reckon, oh, this is that game that they were playing. The weapon disguised as a gift game. Okay. Not our warfare, but fighting them, we understand that they use that. So you better know the terminology. So for example, then, curriculum. What Paulo was talking about, Paulo Freire was talking about education for domestication. That's done through the curriculum. What do you leave in? What do you leave out? Whose story do you tell? Whose history is it? Whose history do you say, oh, this is universal? Right? Whose psychology? Look, I have psych degrees, right? So part of the knowledge that I was given was like Freud and Jung, not Assagioli, even though he's a white male European that basically said spirituality is part of normal psychology. Freud said, oh, spirituality is crazy. Jung might have believed that, but he said, oh, well, let's play with the images, the archetypes. Assagioli says, no, spirituality is real. It's not insanity. But you're not told about Assagioli in a psych class. Right? And then Freud basically says, oh, well, women are crazy, so that's why we string them out on heroin. They're hysterical. Normal psychology for all of humanity is the psychology of a rich, white, European male. That's essentially what they're saying. That's what's normal. For the planet? Okay. And so you don't get to question that in class. You just have to basically accept it, give it back on a test, and you've got to conform to that belief system. Yeah, well, there's another story. A few other stories. So, therapy. What's therapy? What's science? Same thing. Some of these things can be weapons disguised as gifts. So, Arabian horses, literally that horse breed, if you're not an equestrian, you probably know one, but anybody who has bred or rides horses knows that what is referred to as a full-blood Arab, they're willful. That's what they're described as willful, which means they're intelligent. If they sense fear in you, they will throw you. If you do not respect them and they don't sense that, they will throw you. Okay? They're horses that were bred for war. In their original cultural context, not that they speak 100 words, but they were trained to go into battle against guns and cannons and explosions, the screams of battle, getting wounded, all that kind of stuff. They're trained for that. And to not freak out. So your quote-unquote normal horses, the so-called quarter horses, those are 1/4 Arabian. So what they breed out is some of the intelligence so that the animal becomes more docile, more amenable to any rider. But you still have some of the stamina. Right? But pure-blood Arabs, as they're called, were war horses bred for battle. Okay, so Africans being at Troy, that is the Aethiopus in Memnon, the Aethiopus like the Iliad, Homer, Trojan War, the Aeneid, which is the Trojan War, the old Greek poem. The Aethiopus basically mentions Memnon and the honorable Ethiopians. It's a description of the battle at Troy, which of course didn't make it into the movie. Because again, who controls the movie industry, right? So Africans being at Troy can recognize and diffuse Trojan horses and train Arabian, Nubian horses for warfare. So Nubia was where Egypt's gold came from. So Nubia was basically dark-skinned people who could draw on many sources of inspiration, wisdom, and concepts of wealth. For example, like breath and breath control. So a Nubian horse is like an Arabian horse. So this is Bob Marley's Confrontation album, where he is astride essentially an Arabian horse, and striking at the dragon of Babylon. So a Nubian horse is a mind trained to battle Trojan horses or the forces of slavery. The mind, that is the horse, is trained not to react to any situation except at the command of its rider, who remains outwardly calm, focused on the goal, no matter what the enemy does. Because the enemy may use tricks. So you have to stay calm and focused. Okay, so the enemy is anyone who doesn't recognize you as kin. Now, sometimes your kin can be the enemy. Okay? So who does not assist you in liberation of all from bondage, but you have to free yourself. Or as my elders would say, free your mind and your behind will follow. So a Nubian horse is basically, this is a function of the teacher, to teach you to fight back. So it's also the way of the warrior, and also the way of the visionary, and also the healer, simultaneously. And because sometimes when you meet the enemy is you. So in any battle, often the first person that you really have to get a handle on is yourself. But that's why we start with breath work often. Mind is the horse, breath is the bridle. So before you can think outside of the box, you have to know there's a box and that you can get out of it. So still talking about culture generally. You have to know what the box is made of and how it's constructed. So, consensus reality. It's not a philosophy class. Consensus reality is what we agree is real, and it's a construct of reference. Okay, a referent is a psychological object, like an experience. Okay? You're sitting in chairs, but you know that chairs take all kinds of forms, including stools, but a stool is a specific kind of chair, right? You're riding on tables. Your feet are on the floor, as opposed to the ceiling. right? So we're in a 1G field. 1 gravity, 1 Earth gravity. Okay? Not in 0 gravity, not in space. That's what I like about Ender's Game, at least in the movie. They did a good translation of the book into the movie. In 0 gravity, there's no up or down. It changes relative to your position. Up or down only makes sense in a gravity field. All right? So we'll just talk about gravity. We agree what's above us is the ceiling, what's below us is the floor in a gravity field. Right? But our floor can be somebody else's ceiling. And our ceiling can be somebody else's floor. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because a particular focus of discrimination on women started with a term called the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling and the sticky floor. That is, before we could have a woman as a CEO or a president of a college, we had to be able to accept female leadership and not being a model of a male leadership, because that's often what happens in male-run, male-dominant corporations, is in order to succeed in them, you have to adopt a white male perspective as the norm. So if you basically believed in, because remember we had this discussion, I think it was you, Alex, that talked about what is professional? No emotions. Who does that work for? Who does that advantage? Okay? A culture that basically suppresses emotions. So you can't be emotional. Who decided that rule? So, glass ceiling. Glass ceiling is like a one-way mirror. If you're on the floor below the glass ceiling, you can look up and you can see the people in power. But when they're looking down, all they see is themselves. It's a one-way mirror. Okay? Sticky floor. You are being kept on the floor below the floor that calls the shots. And it's hard to get up off of it unless you make certain sacrifices. Like your family, like your children, like any number of things. All right? So the idea that there's a box is constructed. Consensus reality is a box, or like a box. So I'm giving you these reference, okay? The culture has made these normal, and you've accepted them. Don't argue. You have. I have. Okay? So if you think of an experience like a point in space, you could call this psychogeometry. Okay? You have that experience, and then you have others like it. You look at here, look at the bottom, like dots. Usually it's 3 dots to say there's more to the sentence, but let you fill in the blank because you know what it is. Right? And then connect the dots. All right? So before you can think of how to think outside of the box, you have to know that there's a box. So as an example, then, shadow sides of the fourfold way, just to cycle back on that. The way of the warrior, addiction to perfection, which is the shadow side of excellence, and the right use of power. So excellence isn't a thing. Perfection is not a state of flawlessness. It's not a state of flawlessness. In some cultures, for example, I have an Arabian style rug. All right? So Muslim countries, when they produce an artifact like a rug, there's always a flaw in it. The idea is that only God produces stuff that's perfect. We're human. You have to produce a flaw, even in something that's beautiful. right? So it's a different, the flaw is intentional. So the idea is perfection is not a state of flawlessness. So the shadow side of excellence and the right use of power. The wounded child of the north, person who's in this state of addiction, is rebellious, has authority issues and patterns of invisibility, because the basic mode within warrior is you show up and you be present, and that means visible. You don't have to say anything, just your presence is enough. I think the Latin term for it is gravitas. You're heavy. The healer, addiction to intensity. So the way of the healer is to find what has heart and meaning. The opposite of that, the addiction to intensity. The shadow side of love, the wounded child of the South, neediness, being a martyr, many drug addictions. So oftentimes when you find like wounded healers, they're like meth addicts. What does meth do? It basically creates a state of rage that you're numb to. Heroin, yeah, you're numbing pain, but you're not only numbing pain, you're numbing joy. The visionary, shadow side, fixation on what's not working. So you could be telling the truth without blame or judgment that it's not working, but that also means that you're not seeing how it could work or what is working in the situation. So it's the shadow of the four ways of seeing, which are intuition, insight, perception, and vision. The wounded child of the East, you deny your own truth, self-denial, also self-neglect, and false self-esteem. The shadow side of the wisdom way of the teacher, addiction to the need to know. The shadow side of wisdom, a person who's dogmatic, righteous, critical, arrogant. The wounded child of the West, positionality, that is, you're attached to a single position rather than never moving off it and defending it. Judgment, and then control issues. So since I had to tell you about both the non-addicted and the addiction side, so in counselor speak we talk about reframing. You have been, and when I say you, I'm not just pointing the finger, I recognize that it's me because we came out of broadly the same culture. We've been shaped, and addiction shapes you to seek outside solutions to inner problems. Okay? Use outer definition to your inner reality. Okay, so we're framing in a different way. So as if this were a picture frame, or framing in a different, so this concept of this trope, if you will, or metaphor of framing, basically saying a picture frame, but it also could be the frame in which the camera is focusing and focusing in a different way or on a different subject. So, to recreate or self-define a self of origin. So in counselor speak, we say, whatever your family was born into, whether you were adopted or biological, that's your family of origin. Whoever raised you. Family of origin. Now, I'm basically reframing, saying, okay, there's a self of origin too. Some of which you learn in your family of origin, but sometimes if you rebelled against that, then you had to reframe it and define it for yourself. So for example, in order to think out of the box, you have to recognize that there is a box. So for example, what you buy into is what you buy into, you own as a property right with the privileges granted thereunto by God forever and ever. Amen. Which or who is the superior? So just the faces that you can see. So understand, in a cube, there are 6 faces. Right? So first thing that I notice when I'm looking at a person, any person, their race, gender, and class. You can tell that. So when people say, oh, I don't see color, okay, you ain't a dog, you ain't colorblind, you lying. Well, what you're trying to tell me is you feel you don't discriminate against me because I'm black. But don't tell me you don't see color. That's disingenuous. That's like I'm not noticing that you're a quote-unquote boy or a girl. I do see your gender. I can make assumptions about your social class from how you dress. You can see that. So just acknowledge that that's so, okay? So let's not trip about that. Race, gender, and class are the things on the cube you can see right away, instantly. Then you can make other assumptions based on how people talk, what they do, etc., etc. Right? And we've been socialized like that. So that's the contradiction. Oh, I don't see color. Oh, I don't see gender. Yeah, you do. I don't see class. We're a classless society. Yeah, you do. So, also then, again, another part of the box, this is the other part of the cube that you don't necessarily see. Sexual orientation, age, and ability and addiction. These things can often be invisible. Like I don't look like I'm 59, apparently. Right? No. Okay? Hey, you're 59? Yeah. As my grandma would say, good black don't crack. How old would you think I am? Yeah, 40s maybe. Right, I get that a lot. I've gotten carded at Fred Meyer's. I know. It's like, wait, I'm 54. Well, you have a young hairstyle. I had 12 years worth of dreadlocks. A young hairstyle? No. It's like, no, it's been associated with youth culture here, but in my culture, it's especially with the gray, it's like I'm an elder. You know, I survived the CDC death stat, which is basically a black male between the ages of 18 and 44 would die between the ages of 14 and 44, usually at the hands of another black male. Moving to Oregon where there are less black males in LA, I survived longer. But, you know. So basically, this is the other side of the box, and this is why this was in Crash, right? Because we all have privileges and, So for example, then in terms of looking at now systems of discrimination with this particular construct, so type 1, overt individual, type 2, microaggressions, type 3, unconscious organizational, so unconscious institutional discrimination. This is all individual behavior. And then institutional, type 4, overt institutional, type 5, covert institutional, and type 6, socio-structural violence. So within this framework, this is talking about systems of discrimination. This came out of conscientious examen, where you're looking at the contradictions, where it's invisible. You're not taught this unless you basically are taught by somebody that went into black psychology, and we study that. Otherwise, it's invisible. To the, you know, if you take a regular psychology class, APA doesn't recognize that this exists at all. So the reason I'm teaching you this is like, okay, if you live in a culture which basically ignores that discrimination exists, particularly with you, then you get no skill set with it at all. So, intersectionality. This is a 10th degree hypercube. Looks complicated, right? But you can connect the dots and you can see that the dots are hyper-connected. So, within natural mind, so I went to the complication, now I'm going simple. Have we done this yet? No. Okay. All right. So, in the beginning of your life, you begin to learn to separate from yourself from an environment, and form an identity, self of origin, in your family of origin. So, if you are a parent, you've seen this, because this happened to you. A baby learns about object permanence. Object permanence is when, because you'll see this as a psychological stage. Okay? First, babies can't turn themselves over. Then they get the muscle control, the abs and all that kind of stuff, to be able to flip themselves over. If they can do that, then they can develop the muscle control and also the skeletal structure to put themselves on all fours, which is the prerequisite for crawling. Okay? Other than just laying there passively. Once they can flip themselves, then get on all fours, they can crawl. Then their orientation stops being from one point to moving in 2 dimensions. But they don't necessarily understand depth. So they can fall downstairs, even crawling. That's why, we make the thing baby safe, and they're putting things in their mouths, and they're sticking their fingers into light sockets and all that other kind of stuff, all right? So baby learns about object permanence. Object permanence is the psychological state in which baby recognizes that mom still exists when she's not in the room. And baby doesn't cry when mom leaves the room. Because that's a stage. If you've grown up around babies, you've seen this. Object permanence is what it's called in psychology. Right? You can express emotions. They're great at doing that. Acquire language and learning. Learns to eat, walk, and use their body. Be potty trained, all that kind of stuff. These are all psychological stages that are dependent upon other work being done physically, then emotionally, then psychologically. Each one of those is a point, like an experience. So, in geometry, a point is an experience, an emotion, a memory. Points added together make a line. Okay, so you can have a line in a particular set of experiences. Line is a series of points or experiences, some of which are related, some of which may be off the wall or lead to other lines. So for example, each higher dimension contains all the lower ones within it, if you use this as a metaphor for human development, which I am. So a point of view can only see points close to it, or line of thought, which can only see either adjacent lines and points or lines that are similar to its point of view. So for example, I'm xenophilic. Just want you to see the word, right? So, xeno, that means aliens. Phobic means fear. Someone who's afraid of aliens. I'm xenophilic. From the Greek, philos, which means love. I love aliens. Aliens are cool. Right? Ender's Game is about humanity being attacked by a group of telepathic ants that have faster than light space travel. And all the ants want is water, and that's why they come to Earth. But the ant psychology is this. The only person in the colony is the queen. That's the only one that has thoughts. All the workers are like individuals. Well, they're not individuals. They're part of the queen. So if a worker ant dies, no biggie. Produce another. The Formics, the aliens, they attack Earth because they want the water, but they think that we've got queens. They don't recognize that each individual human is a completely separate genome. Once they learn that, they don't come back. But humans are like freaked out. Oh, we got to wipe them out. Because they can't conceive that, oh, well, they haven't tried to communicate with us. Well, they're telepathic. They don't use words. They've built a whole civilization around one being and millions of extensions of that being. And those one beings can build faster than light starships. It takes a sensitive kid who's been bullied and learned how to respond against bullies to define, to be able to see, wow, I love my enemy and then I can understand them, but at that point when I understand them, I destroy them. Reason I went off on that, okay? If you can only see your own point of view, and points of view like yours, you can't see others. And if there's a culture based on only seeing it's us against them, you can run into trouble when you reach the friendly aliens. So, point, line. So a line can see other lines and points, but not squares and more complex structures. So yeah, remember that? So you have experiences in your body. You have experiences with your emotions. You have experiences with your mind, and you also have spiritual experiences. You might not have the definition. So in some forms of psychology, spiritual experiences look like insanity. Now, I ain't saying all paranoid schizophrenics are spiritual. I ain't saying that. I'm just saying that from the point of view of certain forms of psychology, particularly Freudian, Freud thought that spiritual experiences were delusions. Well, he shot cocaine, so, I mean, why would I even believe him? I mean, he describes what he describes very well. But there's some points, you know, again, this is a 19th century pre-germ theory psychology. No neurochemistry. I mean, again, you can't judge him about what we know about in the 21st century. Okay, so the point being, in addiction, one's attention is focused on a single point or a single line to the exclusion of others. Pretty much. And that means that the other lines of experience get ignored in service of not feeling uncomfortable. Or not feeling comfortable in your own skin. Or not feeling connected. So the person I described earlier, who basically felt that they are totally alone unless they're connected by other people electronically who are not in the room, is suffering from the inability to sit with herself alone for extended periods of time and still feel connected. Transpersonal, oh, well, that's a problem. You need to feel connected while you're by yourself. Then you can connect to other people. But if your culture doesn't teach you to do that, then you freak out if somebody doesn't answer your text. Nobody reads your Facebook posts. I mean, who's deciding who your identity is? And how is that being shaped? So part of what I'm talking about in terms of developing a self of origin is being able to redefine who you are in relation to everything else. We are social creatures, yes. But what makes us strong individually is that connection and exploring what those connections are when you're alone and when you connect up with other people. Because sometimes you hang with the wrong crowd because you never had a strong sense of self. You get yourself from who you hang with. instead of following your own vision. So we'll continue this more on Thursday when your, let's see, papers and midterm is due, and should have your grades posted by then too. Till then, stay strong. Yeah, go ahead.
Online.